What a great shot to start off our folio critique. It's a really strong dramatic shot of a groom and a beautiful use of ambient light and shallow depth of field. Very nice. Those shadows on the groom's face are a lot more acceptable on a guy than on a girl. Although we have a handsome groom, it appears as though the groom has a longish nose. If his nose crossed the bridge of his cheek, it would have made his nose look that whole lot longer. So the photographer's done extremely well to keep that position perfect there. I think if we cropped his forearm out here and that flower on the bottom left-hand side, it would just bring your attention so much more onto his face, but beautiful shot, very nice. Great angle for him to have the groom looking into the camera. Great decision to crop out the identities of the groomsmen there, which really brings your attention in on the groom. Actually, looking at this shot, it looks a lot like another shot that I critiqued in one of our earlier chapters. In fact, I think it is. It was one of my suggestions to crop out the identity of the guys. So the photographer that's done this, I think it's fantastic that you've seen something that you've liked, you've emulated it, and you've put your own little twist on it. Fantastic. Well done. I like the idea behind this shot. Love the foreground-background composition there with the straw in the foreground and the dramatic angles and house in the background. But looking at those guys, I just can't seem to get out of my head the fact that, where their hands are placed, it looks as if they're going to the toilet. So, like the idea, but yeah, it's just missing the point for me. But yeah, I'm sorry. Pardon me. It's a beautiful shot of a beautiful bride. I like the way she's positioned. It's obviously a very stylized pose there. Would have liked to have seen her right hand perhaps that little bit higher so we can see more of her hand. Otherwise it looks a little bit distorted. Perhaps having her lean towards the camera that little bit more would have emphasized her shape even more so. And I like the repetition of that fence there along with that negative space. I'm a big fan of foreground and background composition. It's really nice the way the photographer has tried something a little bit different here, having the bride in the foreground with the girls in the background. My instinct is telling me that the girls should be perhaps that little bit closer together, perhaps overlapping each other in the background there, and really using a shallow depth of field to focus right in on the bride. There's some beautiful light tickling the bride and the two bridesmaids on the right-hand side, especially the way they're positioned. But do you see there with the girls on the left-hand side, they're turning away from the light, but looking at their faces are away from the light also, which has that sort of awkward patch on their skin there, her cheek and her nose. It just doesn't seem to feel right. It looks as though we're trying to go for a cool, sassy, sort of classy look, but that bridesmaid on the left-hand side with a cheesy grin just breaks it for everybody. She ruins it for everyone. A couple more things would really help this image if those two girls on the left-hand side actually turned their face towards a light source, and in fact if all the girls weren't so flat-footed, it would just add that little bit extra finesse to this image. Although the rest of the location really helps the strength of this image, unfortunately we've actually captured that really strong highlight, that sky between the trees, which is really taking my focus off the subject matter. What a beautiful moment captured. Great expression from the bride, very emotional, and the groom softly looking on. Beautiful. Depending on how close we can get to the couple, sometimes there's nothing you can do to get rid of that patchy light on their faces. Now, of course, if you were close enough, you could use some fill-in flash to just even out that lighting on their faces, or at least the expression beats the perfection of this shot. Nice soft moment between the bride and the groom, and I love the way that foliage is framing their faces. I don't mind that soft hand of the bride's holding the groom's lapel, but I'm not too certain about the groom's right arm. It just looks like it's dangling on by his side. I would have liked to have seen the groom actually embrace the bride so that their arms and their hands really mirror exactly what the faces are doing. I can see in this photograph in particular that the photographer has actually gone for the location rather than the beautiful lighting. The beautiful lighting is actually hitting the bride's back rather than highlighting that beautiful moment between the bride and the groom. Most of the time I imagine my bride and groom as if they were standing on a turntable, so I might have a beautiful moment, but if I just twist them around without changing anything else, just turn their positioning around, I can often see that beautiful light hitting exactly where I want it to go. This image has a real fashion and editorial appeal. It's kind of a different pose than we've seen before. I quite like this shot. I would have loved to have seen this image actually flipped around so that the groom is on the left and the bride just sort of falls off on the right-hand side, because as we know, our eyes read naturally from top left to bottom right. So if we tailor make our composition to suit that flow, it's more pleasing to the eye. The photographer has done extremely well to actually place the groom's left hand on his knee, which hides the awkwardness of the bride's armpit there. Having a groom sit down and part his knees though, it just looks slightly feminine, which I don't really think suits this groom. Quite like the expression from the bride, although her neck looks really tense the way she's sitting there. If she just softened up her neck a little bit and perhaps turned her face to the right and leant towards or perhaps away from the photographer, it would have just been a bit more comfortable for her. Now, there doesn't always have to be a connection between the bride and groom if you're going for that fashionable editorial look. So I'm not really too sure if I would have asked the groom to look at the bride. Perhaps he would have looked a bit awkward. Looking away, I'm just not feeling at the moment. Although the lighting is actually quite beautiful on his face, I'm almost thinking a connection with a camera would have been really cool. The shallow depth of field really works here, and also that slight foliage in the foreground just leads your eye into the subjects. I believe cropping this image just underneath the groom's left hand and the bride's bust line there, and flipping it, which brings our attention to the bride and groom, would actually make this image sing even louder than it already does. This is a real beautiful moment between the bride and the groom. The lighting is really pretty, backlighting them very subtly, and I love the negative space here and the shallow depth of field. A common mistake with posing the bride this way is actually getting the bride's right arm over the left arm. That would mean that we wouldn't be able to see the bride's hands, which would almost make her hands look amputated. So in posing the bride's arms over the groom's shoulders, it's very important that the outer arm, the outer hand, crosses over the one that's closest to the camera, just as the photographer has done here. Just a little softening of those hands would just add that little bit more finesse. I love the bride's expression here. She looks amazing. Although the light is shining on the bride and groom, it's actually broad lighting the bride especially, and making her look a little bit heavier than she actually is. Often we go to a park or a setting like this and we see a park bench, and we automatically assume that we actually can't move that seat or bench to suit us. We certainly can. This shot could have been taken perhaps in the same way, but just getting that chair or that bench and twisting it around so we get some beautiful lighting falling across their bodies and faces, really highlighting that beautiful moment and causing a bit more modelling on their faces and bodies. The groom's left hand looks that little bit tentative. Would have loved to have seen him hug the bride with both hands. I believe the bride's arms are too close to her body. If she separated her arms from her body, it would have slimmed them down even more so. Although I'm a huge fan of negative space, I don't seem to think the negative space on the right-hand side seems to work here. Photographing through foliage here actually makes us feel like we're a voyeur, sort of perving on the bride and groom as they share a moment. Although the out of focus foliage and the negative space, I believe, is more of a distraction than a help to this image. Overall, this folio is extremely strong. We've seen some great uses of lighting and some not as great, although the expression has made up for it. I encourage you to always look for the light first, then the location. If a location attracts you first, be sure to actually manipulate the situation where you're in a position where the lighting suits you also. And always remember that perfection is nothing without emotion and expression. Well, if you can get all of the above, well, now we're talking. Well done to the photographer for a fine and consistent effort.